Well, sir, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with us.
Sure, glad to be with you.
Let's talk about the November 8th election that ended up with this runoff. What's your general assessment of the fairness of that election? What kind of grade would you give it?
Well, I wouldn't give it as high a grade as we deserve. If we're doing as well as Florida, we got a lot of room for improvement. Here's what I think a lot of folks need to understand about what's different about this election. The problems that have come up are not new, but they may be new on a lot of people's radar, and because they weren't on people's radar before. In a blowout election, in a political setting when most everybody knows what the outcome is going to be and it's not even close, you can afford to have a lot of sloppiness on the bureaucratic side, on the administrative side. You can have a lot of vagueness and ambiguity with questions being answered in Appling County differently than the way they're being answered in Worth County. You can afford a lot of play in the joints, and if someone gets caught up in it, if the call goes one way in one county and another in another county, it won't really matter much in the scheme of things if the number of people affected by that is small, but the difference in the election is big.
Right.
In a blowout, you can afford to have a lot of sloppiness. You'll have lots of people complaining about it, but they won't complain about the outcome. They'll just complain about the process. But you have a close election. You have an election that's really important, and it's really close. Then the little problems that we've tolerated, either through indifference or because of political partisan advantage, the little things really mean a lot in a close election. And that's what we've been through for the first time in as long as I can remember. This is the first big election in Georgia that's been as close as it has. And all these little problems, whether it's the exact match problem, which is a bureaucratic problem that catches a lot of people who are through no fault of their own, the purge program that we're running that purges people who've moved and people who died, but also people who got no notice of something and done nothing wrong, but they've been purged without knowing about it. These things that we've tolerated for a long time really mean a lot when they affect enough people to affect the outcome of an election. The worst thing about it is you can't say whether it affected the election or not, because it's impossible to connect the dots between the things that happens to 53,000 people over here and who bothers to challenge that and test it on election day, or 150,000 people over there who've been purged without notice. How can they challenge something? They'll find out about it when they get to the polls. These are problems where you really can't say how it affected the outcome. What we need and what we're entitled to is a process that is clean and consistent and efficient so that we can call a close election just as early as we can call a blowout election. And we can have as much confidence in the call of a close election as we have in the call of a blowout election. We can't say that now, but there are lots of things that we can do. And the main thing is to commit ourselves to fixing these problems. These are not problems that are insoluble. These are problems that we can fix. The difference is between those who say, I don't want to fix it, I don't think it's much of a problem because it didn't affect me or it didn't affect my team, and those folks who say, look, it doesn't matter which team it helps or hurts. If it happens to anybody, it's wrong. And we should do everything we can to make sure this process is just as clean and accurate as possible.
Yeah. Now, the law that allows for the purging of inactive voters was written back in 1997 when Democrats were in charge at the state capitol. So is it unfair to suggest that this is a Republican effort to suppress the vote?
Here's the thing. We don't know what was on people's minds at the time. I'm sure it was a good idea at the time. And I can show you these rules and this complicated formula, and anybody reading it for the first time, and yeah, it looks pretty reasonable to me, but if you know how it works in practice, you realize what it means is honest citizens who are registered to vote, whose only sin is they skip a presidential election, may find out that they're purged and they got no actual notice of this whatsoever.
Aren't they supposed to get something in the mail?
Yeah, they're supposed to get something in the mail. And we get stuff in the mail all the time, but also stuff that's sent to us in the mail doesn't arrive. Or you can get the stuff in the mail and you can read it. And if you have that, the insight of a Harvard lawyer, you can realize all you have to do is vote in the next election. You don't have to send anything back, but something may happen at the next election that you can't control. Or you may realize, something might happen at the next, I'm going to send this thing back just to make sure, and the Secretary of State's office may not get it. My point is this, we know that this form of notice is accurate in part and very inaccurate in part. It results in people being deemed to have moved or died when they haven't. and without any actual notice whatsoever to the voter. Now, there's no excuse for that. I don't know what they were thinking about in 1997, but we've had 21 years of experience with the way this law works in practice. And anybody who thinks, I can get away with this because of who did it back then when they weren't thinking about these problems, that's an idiotic argument. We wouldn't put up with that from our kids. We certainly shouldn't put up with it from our policymakers.
Okay. Now, when the U.S. Supreme Court upheld this law in an Ohio case, a very similar law, you responded on Twitter and said, "As your next Secretary of State, I'll protect citizens who choose not to vote and keep them from being purged from the voter rolls." Now,
with people who choose not to vote.
Right. Now, Mr. Raffensperger says that if you do that, you'll end up with unclean voter rolls and it opens the door for voter fraud. What do you say?
Well, there's several things to say to that. First off, nobody who's on the rolls can vote unless they show up in person and produce that ID. Right. The ID is the answer, the end-all, be-all to the problem of someone voting who's not entitled to vote. If you have to have that ID, you're going to be okay.
Now, you were opposed to that at one time.
No,
right?
I'm not opposed to that. I believe we ought to use IDs to show who people are. I think we ought to produce IDs all the time. The only place where I disagree with my opponent and with those people who are taking really an unsympathetic view of this issue is to deal with that very small percentage of people who can't get the new kind of IDs through no fault of their own because they literally don't have the document that you've got to have, the all-important birth certificate. There are some people who can't get them, not because they're too lazy to get one, they literally don't exist. Or they did exist in the past, but they disappeared when the courthouse burned down. I mean, the idea of the ID is we can use a good ID in order to avoid the exact match problem. The fact that the driver's department, the Department of Driver Services, the one that issues the license, they get the information right because they're the ones you got to produce the birth certificate to. But Secretary of State's office uploads it manually and you got to tell them about it in person. That's lots of ways in which there can be a difference between what's right and what's wrong. Now, back to the subject of voting rolls. I mean, of course we have to maintain voting rolls, but we ought to use information that's accurate. And using a process that you know to a moral certainty is going to have a highly inaccurate percentage of the folks that are being purged from the list is just indefensible. You talked about the Supreme Court's decision. I've read the Supreme Court's decision. I'd encourage anybody to read it because they're not saying what was done in that case was fair. They're not even saying what was done in that case was constitutional. They were merely blaming Congress for it by saying two different laws that Congress passed, one in 1993 and one in 2002, neither of which were passed by the same Congress at the same time, and neither of which say what the Supreme Court said. Read them both together, and that's the result, and they're blaming Congress for it. It's bad old Congress's fault. And of course, if we've got it wrong, well, Congress can always fix it. That's the same kind of passive-aggressive thing that the court sometimes uses when they're rewriting the rules and daring Congress to come and clean up the mess they've made. But they never said it was constitutional, and they never said it was fair because those issues were not raised in that case. It was the narrowest possible case where they simply said, you can't hang your hat on what Congress said because we say Congress didn't say that. Well, that's not addressing the issue of fairness. Right. It's not addressing the issue of due process, that you have an actual notice and opportunity to be heard before your name is stricken from the rolls. And I don't care what they were thinking in 97, and I don't give anybody a pass because it may have been a Democratic majority then. That does not control what we do today. If we know what's going on today is wrong, we have an obligation to fix what's going on today. And folks hiding behind what other folks did 21 years ago is no excuse. Okay, so you've said we don't have to make it hard to vote to make it hard to cheat. Absolutely.
So what's the answer?
The answer is to make it as easy as possible for folks to vote, while at the same time making it impossible to cheat. I think IDs have the largest role to play in this. But I also think making it possible for folks to vote at home, to streamline the process for folks to be able to get absentee ballots, that would solve the precinct problem, the problem we have of trying to have these administrative districts that are just for voting purposes, but they don't coincide with any of the political jurisdictions that people get to vote in. You can go to one precinct and have 10 different elections going on there, and you're supposed to get one of 10 different ballots, and they'll give you the wrong ballot. They won't try and do it. It's because they're screwing up all the time and giving folks the wrong ballot. We could solve that problem almost completely if we made it possible for more folks to vote at home. I mean, there are lots of ways in which they're doing it better in other states than they are in Florida. And I don't want to use Florida as my excuse for the way we're doing it here in Georgia.
Okay. What should be done about the voting machines?
The voting machines should be decertified. The process should have been begun a long time ago. A lot of folks don't realize that the legislature, which bought these machines in 2002, was very deliberate and very careful about their concerns about the fact that we were going down a digital highway with our voting process that we'd never gone down before. And we didn't know where it was going to take us. And we didn't know what kind of forks in the road we were going to come to. And they were very careful, much more careful than the current legislature, I might add, but they were very careful to provide that the Secretary of State's going to be the cop who's going to watch and make sure that these machines are not only easy to use, but they're absolutely foolproof. Now, that's the plain English of it. But the legalese is a little bit more complicated. But the plain English is you have to certify, Secretary of State, that these machines literally cannot be hacked. And once you determine that they can be hacked, not that they have been, not that they will be, but they can be tampered with, then it's your job as Secretary of State to decertify these machines. Don't worry, we got a backup process in place. Hand-marked paper ballots using optical scanners to provide a quick and unofficial count of the marked ballot is what the state law requires right now for absentee voters. It's also what the state law requires right now whenever the Secretary of State does his or her job of deciding that these machines no longer meet the statutory criteria of reliability. And that's been proven in Judge Totenberg's court to the satisfaction of anybody who watches y'all's news programs or reads the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. That's been proven that these machines are vulnerable enough that they can be hacked. But beyond that, forget the hacking problem. These things are breaking down right in front of us. There are people who are having machines they're old. I mean, these machines are they've all long outlived their shelf life. And back in February, while the General Assembly was still in session, I called for the Secretary of State then, and I called for my opponents for this race to call for the decertification of these machines for this year's election while there was still time to prepare for everybody to be able to vote the old-fashioned way with hand-marked paper ballots where they could see the ballot they're casting and an election official can actually count the ballot that the voter actually cast. And you can't do that now. So I called for fixing this problem in the way that complies with state law back in February. My opponent opposed that. He's all in favor of doing something about it after this election, but not in time for this election. I think that was a defect of office then. I think it's a defect of office now.
So what kind of machines, if we have machines at all, should the state have? What would John Barrow do going forward in terms of making the vote fair?
Well, the first thing that I would do is I would not just talk to the vendors to see who's got the most expensive whiz-bang machine that can do our jobs for us, of marking a ballot for us that we get to read and look at and cast physically. I'd much rather look at the practices they're engaging in other states. What are the best practices that folks are doing? Why are they doing it one way in most parts of this country and not doing it the way the vendors want you to do it?
Yeah.
Well, maybe they realize.
You must have an idea now what you prefer.
Well, the idea that I think certainly makes the most sense, and certainly the one that is validated by the choices that most states are casting around the country, is hand-marked paper ballots, having these machines that are necessary to actually mark a physical ballot for those people who need a machine in order to mark. You know, we actually have a ballot marking machine. We're born with one. It's called our hands. Now, there are people who can't do that, and federal law requires that we make full provision for folks like that. Sure. But we can do that at the cost of $30 million. But if everybody has to mark the ballot on one of these machines, we're going to be spending $150 million to do it. It's not fiscally conservative to make that decision to buy these machines, and it's not fiscally conservative when you realize these machines have a high maintenance cost. You got to store them, you got to secure them, you got to test them every time you're using them. This is a huge burden for our election official bureaucracy in this state. They're straining trying to keep up with all kinds of things. We should make it easy on them, easy on the voter, and easy on the taxpayer. So what I think is what would certainly win such an examination. What are the best practices out there? Certainly, I think the winning hand is going to be the one where 80% of the public in this country is doing it right now, hand-marked paper ballots, using new and improved optical scanners, not the kind my opponent's talking about that they're using in Florida, which are as old as our machines and not as reliable, but aren't the reason for the problems for a week and a half delay in Florida. The real reason they're having problems in Florida is the same reason we're having them here in Georgia. It's all these other things we were talking about. But we ought to use new and improved scanners to provide to improve the voting experience, so that if you mark your ballot improperly, the machine will give you a chance to fix it before it takes it away from you. But also it'll give you a quick and reliable but unofficial count of a ballot that can actually be counted by human eyes and a bipartisan review whenever there's a need to do that. And that's the process they're following in most places. I think it's the one that would win out hands down. But we're not even thinking about that right now, because the current commitment is to buy the most expensive machines to do for all of us what we only need machines to do for the physically disabled. And I think that's a waste of money, and is a waste of future money when you consider the cost of maintaining this infrastructure over the years.
Okay. Brad Raffensperger says if liberal John Barrow is elected, there will be more illegal votes than ever. Your response?
We haven't got any illegals voting in this state now, according to our former Secretary of State, our current Secretary of State, and all the local election officials. I agree with my opponent that making sure illegals can't vote is a problem that we need to be vigilant about. But we're solving that problem every single election, because we're using the forms of identification that the federal government required states to use for driving and for getting on a plane. I voted for that law because I think you should not be able to get an identification card that shows that you're a citizen when you're not. And so I voted to tighten up these rules because that was a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission. We'll solve the problem of illegal voting last week. But how about the problem of people who are being kicked off the rolls without knowing about it? Or people who are being deprived of a clear green light to vote because the Secretary of State won't say one way or the other whether or not the DDS, which is right, matches up with their records, which are wrong. And they refuse to fix it on their end. That's unacceptable. The real challenge that we got here is to recognize that we're not going to solve this problem unless we do it in a bipartisan fashion. I mean, think about it. If, in this day and age, if anything is important enough to really get it right, we're not going to get it right if one side's driving the train and it's being done in a highly partisan fashion. It's got to be done in a bipartisan fashion. And working across party lines to get things done is a promise that I have kept all of my adult life. It's a promise that I have kept under the most trying circumstances in American politics as the most bipartisan member of the most partisan legislature in the country, the Congress.
Yeah.
That's a promise
one
that
of the last white Southern Democrats.
Absolutely. And that's a promise my opponent's not even making, much less capable of keeping. We also learned that if it's really important to be done in a bipartisan fashion, it's not going to happen unless it has to be done in a bipartisan fashion. Let's face the realities. Democrats don't want to work with Republicans any more than Republicans want to work with Democrats. That's how bad things have gotten in this country. And they won't work with each other unless they have to, unless the government is divided in some respect. That's the check and the balance that the framers gave us, the only one that belongs to the people and not to politicians. And if we elect somebody who's lying his way into office, whether it's about his taxes or my position on the records, but he's part of the same partisan team that's running this show, then we're not going to get anything done in a bipartisan fashion. On the other hand, if we elect somebody who's the most moderate, most bipartisan member of Congress when he was there, the guy who's actually kept this kind of progress of working with people on both sides of the aisle, then we're going to get some bipartisanship out of it because we'll have to. And I think that's the real opportunity in this election, is for us to bring some balance back into our deliberations. No one's going to be able to do it on their own. Of course the legislature is supreme in this area, and of course the government is a partner in the legislative process in the way that the Secretary isn't. But somebody ought to be in there to advocate for the voter who's been kicked off the rolls in error and without even knowing about it. Somebody's got to advocate for the person who's given the right information and proven to DDS that they're a citizen, but the Secretary of State's records are wrong. Somebody's got to stand up for the voter in this process. And it's becoming increasingly important that we address these little problems. They may be little to some people, they're not so little to others, but none of it's little if it keeps you from voting, or if it keeps someone you know from voting, or someone you don't know from voting but has every right to vote. We've got to fix these problems. And we can do it, but we've got to work together.
Okay. Mr. Raffensperger says your ad about his tax liens is simply dishonest, that he's got $30 million a year in business in 30 different states. He's paid up on his taxes. The ad actually does say he owed those taxes, not that he owes them. Is there anything about that ad that you feel uncomfortable about?
No, and I'll tell you why. if you think the purpose of state law is to make sure that the qualification form you file is to make sure you ultimately pay your taxes, if you think that's the real purpose of that requirement, then I guess it's okay if someone pays his taxes late. But the real purpose is to make sure no one qualifies who's delinquent on his taxes. The question is not whether or not he paid it when someone made him do it after he filed. The question is whether or not he was telling the truth when he filed his qualification papers. And the ad is true in that his Republican opponents are the ones who made these claims. That's true. The research that they did is true. It is true that when he filed his papers and stated under oath that he did not owe any taxes, that was not true when he said it. And he kept on doing it. He was a serial tax dodger. 2011, City Council. 2015, State Legislature. 2017, when he qualified for this job. But integrity counts, and he's running for the office whose responsibility is to make sure that other folks are telling the truth when they file these papers. He's not a tax collector. He's supposed to make sure that you meet the qualifications. Now, what Brad has shown is that he knows what the loophole is. You can not tell the truth when you file your papers and not pay your taxes until someone makes you do it. And it was his Republican primary runoff opponent who filed the complaint to get him kicked off the ballot that caused him to finally pay his taxes. Now, if you think, again, this whole purpose of this is just to help people who are late in their taxes, oops, I forgot, or oops, the dog, ate all of my tax liens. If you think the whole purpose of this is to make sure that folks ultimately pay the taxes, you're missing the point. The point is, when you're making a statement, qualifying in writing under oath, that you are a faithful citizen and you've paid all your taxes, that not be a lie when you say it. Because it's going to be his job making sure that somebody else ain't lying when they're saying it. And you can't expect somebody to do the job of keeping the rules when he's breaking the rules every time he's applied for the job. So character does count. This is not a tax collection scheme. This is a qualification for office that he's failed every time. But he's exploited the loophole. He's waited for somebody to sue him over it. And I think that reveals an appalling lack of character and certainly a lack of fitness for this particular job.
Okay. One of your ads says, yeah, I'm a Democrat, but I won't bite you.
Yeah.
Why did you feel a need to make that assurance? And how do you appeal as a moderate to the progressives who were so energized by Stacey Abrams' campaign to get them to come out again?
Well, first off, I think look, if we got a problem in this country, and we do have a problem in this country, I think you ought to shine a light on it. And the problem in this country is people are so dug in, they're so polarized, usually about their feelings toward the opposition more than about the feelings for their own team. That's a real problem in American politics today. And I have felt the obligation every time I have run for office to tell folks I'll work in a bipartisan fashion. I'll work across party lines to get things done. I did it as a county commissioner, and I did it under the most trying circumstances in American politics today as a member of Congress. I did it when I was representing the most Democratic district in the country that had been previously represented by a Republican, and when I had been gerrymandered into the most Republican district in the country represented by a Democrat. That was my promise then, and I kept that promise every day I was on the job. But there are people out there who are so polarized in their points of view that they really think nothing good comes from the other side. And I feel an obligation to reach out to folks and say, look, you don't have to worry about that in my case. I think there's a little good in the worst of us and a little bit of bad in the best of us. And what we need is two parties that are as good as they can be, not one party that's on the ends and one party that's on the outs. And that's what I think is ultimately for the people to decide. But if you're going to reach out to folks, you got to reach across the aisle. You got to tell them, I understand what you're feeling about this issue. I feel the same way you do about it. And I got the scars to show for it too. I'm proud of the fact that when I was serving in the most partisan legislature in the country, that I had the kind of endorsements for folks that you don't usually get for someone who thinks of himself as a Sam Nunn Democrat. I was regularly endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I was regularly endorsed by the National Federation of Independent Businesses. I was regularly endorsed by the National Association of Manufacturers. It's because I believed it, and I practiced what I believe, that you got to work in a bipartisan fashion for two reasons. First, it's the way we're supposed to do things, whether we like it or not. It's the way we're supposed to do things. But secondly, forget that. From a purely pragmatic point of view, it's the only way to get anything done. Right. If it's really worth, now there are lots of things you can get done on a purely partisan basis, but they won't stand the test of time. They ain't much worth doing. But if it's worth doing right, if it's really important that it be done right, it's got to be done in a bipartisan fashion, because otherwise the result won't hold. There'll be no buy-in, they'll have no public support, and all of your efforts are for naught. And so I definitely think that's an issue folks need to confront. I've confronted it under the most intense conditions in American politics, and I want folks to know that.
Well, you've got a real challenge now because Republicans tend to do well in runoffs in Georgia. So what's the strategy to get Democrats out again?
Well, it's an equal opportunity challenge, isn't it? Because there are a lot of folks who don't know there's an election coming up on Tuesday. A lot of folks don't know early voting is going on right now. Right. My challenge is to get my votes out and not get the other side's votes out for them. And I'm doing the best I can to reach out to people that I think care about the direction in which our country is headed, want someone in this office who's committed to fixing these problems, who won't exaggerate how big they are, but will realize that even small problems are huge issues in a close election. And we've entered into an era where that's going to happen with greater frequency. And if you like what's going on in Florida and want more of that, then vote for my opponent because he wants to defend the status quo. I want to fix what's broke with our elections, because I'm convinced if we can fix what's broke with our elections, we can fix what's broke with our politics too.
Now, if you were to run for governor in 4 years or 8, would you stay in office as Secretary of State and oversee your own election?
First off, I have no intention of running for any other office, but this is what I know, and this is what I believe. What previous Secretaries of State have done, Republican and Democrat, sets a good pattern for all of us to follow. Former Secretaries of State, Democratic and Republican, have done either one of two things when they have decided that they felt a call to run for something else. They've either resigned from the job that they had so they could devote full-time energies to it, or at the very least, they have recused themselves. That's a fancy legal word for saying, I'm going to step back and not be involved in any way on any issue that can affect the politics of my election. Now that's what former Secretaries of State have done, and it's what I would do. It's the very least that we can do in order to make sure folks don't think that you got your thumb on the scale, if not for your team, then for yourself. The Secretary of State shouldn't have his or her thumb on the scale for himself or for his team. We should do the right thing without regard to party, and you certainly should do the right thing without regard to your own political interest.
Okay, I have one last question for you, and then if you'd like to add anything, that's fine as well. But obviously, you're glad to be in this runoff, and you're in the runoff because the Libertarian got 2% of the vote, and
I think 2.5, something like that.
Yeah, and kept Mr. Raffensperger from getting 50+1. Is there something undemocratic about a situation where we find ourselves, where fewer people are going to decide this race on this week and December 4th than would have decided it earlier this month?
There is a way to solve that problem, and my Libertarian friend, Smythe Duvall, who's endorsed me in this race, and I both agree on the easiest solution to that problem, and that's allow the same folks who vote in the first round to vote in the second round at the same time. It's called ranked choice voting. That's the easiest way to solve that problem. As far as the problem,
would you like to see that happen in Georgia?
I've supported that idea. I think it's a great idea, especially since we have peculiarities in Georgia law that make runoffs very different if they're federal elections as opposed to state elections. We have a different runoff deadline for federal races because of federal statutes than we have for state races. And I think that's crazy. And Smythe and I agree on the most common sense solution to that problem. My opponent, by the way, is opposed to that solution to this problem. But look at it another way. Yes, fewer people decide, but it's an equal opportunity experience for the supporters of folks on both sides. And the power of your vote actually goes up in an election, a runoff election, when fewer people vote. And that may be looking pretty hard to find the positive side of things, but if your chance of winning this election, of casting the winning vote, is a 1 in 400,000 chance, that's a whole lot better than a 1 in 4 million chance. My point is this: it's an equal opportunity challenge. The voters get to decide how important they think it is, and they get the final say in this thing. And I think that's important.
John Barrow, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate you coming by. Thank you.
You bet.